And so if you're looking at Ecclesiastes with me, it starts off with that sense, that idea of wisdom. Verse 1 is asks the question, who is like the wise? Who knows the explanation of things? A person's wisdom brightens their face, and it changes their hard appearance. And so there's a statement, kind of a proverb, and along with a metaphorical way of saying that if you have wisdom, right, your face brights, it shines, it's almost like Mike back there. He's got this bright, happy face, right? And of course, wisdom will bring that, because when we look at people who are happy as opposed to people who are down and downcast, you can see it in their face, their features, right? Opposed to somebody who has a bright face. So that the teacher is telling us that if we could just get wisdom, we might have joy, might have happiness, walk around with a smile, right? And so wisdom is something that we should try to get. The problem with that, I think, is that it's really difficult to know what the wise decision is all the time, right? So chapter 7 was about knowing what is good all the time. And what we found in chapter 7 was that a lot of the things that are really good for us are the things that we try to avoid, right? And chapter 8 is going to be about how wisdom, right? Wisdom is a good thing. It makes your face shine like Moses. It's a good thing, but it's really difficult to know how to be wise in all of our dealings with the world. We're going to go into the world, and we're going to experience people of power, and we're going to be subject to different rulers, and we have to ask ourselves, well, what is the wise choice to do in this situation? And those circumstances are going to change, and how do we know what is good, what is wise? I would tell you, as Ken pointed out, Jesus his word leads to wisdom, but wisdom is also very circumstantial. And I want to read you a proverb that makes this point. And it's one that I like reading because it just makes so little sense sometimes. It's Proverbs chapter 26, verses 4 and 5. I'll read the first proverb, and then I'll read the second proverb and see if in your wisdom you can make sense out of these two. Verse 4 of chapter 26 says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you yourself will be just like him." Got it? Don't answer a fool according to his folly. Here's verse 5. "Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes." So what is the wisdom? Which one are you supposed to do? Wait a second. Now, the writer of Proverbs couldn't be that far off, right? He's writing these sentences. They're right next to each other. Verse 4 precedes verse 5, and verse 5 comes after verse 4. And verse 4 says, "Do not answer a fool according to his words." And verse 5 says, "Answer a fool according to his words." What are we supposed to do? Maybe wisdom is sometimes circumstantial, and these are principles that say you have to decide what to do based on the situation or maybe the fool that you're talking to, right? Like sometimes we want to answer the fool because we can't just let him go around and spread his foolishness everywhere. And then there are other times, other circumstances where we do not want to answer the fool because we'll lower ourselves down to his standards. See, wisdom is not always so clear-cut, is it? We have to know how to be wise, but be wise in the circumstance that we're in. When do we answer a fool, and when do we keep our mouth shut? Wisdom is that thing that's going to brighten our face when we know how to live correctly in the world. But here's the problem. As the writer of Ecclesiastes has pointed out, the world's crooked. It's sometimes hard to understand. Now, I learned some wisdom this week, not this week, but previous week. I learned some wisdom about how to paint, right? And behind me, I painted the wall, and I didn't sand any of the spackle spots down. So I learned before we painted the rest of the church that you have to sand the spackle spots down, or you're going to have spotted walls everywhere. Now, you're lucky for me, they're behind the curtain, right? We learned that lesson before we painted the rest of the church. That was something that I learned. Wisdom is a good thing, but sometimes you have to make those mistakes in order to know how to handle that. I also learned that if I ever paint the church again, I'll probably put plastic down all over the floors, right? Because painter's tarps is a good thing in certain situations, in certain circumstances. But when you have 20 volunteers walking around the church making circles, they step on the painter's tarp, and then they walk on the floor, and guess what you have on the floor? Paint. I have a Vans print from my shoe right here next to me on the stage, right? My point that I'm making is wisdom's important. You have to know how to do things, and there were people that were far more wise about painting than I am. But even then, wisdom is about circumstances. Sometimes you have to use a painter's tarp, and sometimes it's better to use plastic, right? It's circumstantial. We have to know wisdom, and if we do, it brightens our face. And so the writer of Ecclesiastes is going to give us two scenarios as we live in this world, as we walk around in a world that's crooked or a world that's just based under the sun, and we have to deal with problems. What is the wise thing to do in those situations? So the first advice is going to be in our relationship with the king. And understand when he's saying king, he's talking about his king, right? Or as we think Solomon wrote it, he's talking about himself, right? But this applies to us with governing authorities. Here's what he says in verse 2, and this is going to be my first point. Be wise when serving the king, knowing that power is in the hands of God. In verse 2, he says this, obey the king's command, I say, because you took an oath before God. Do not be in a hurry to leave the king's presence. Do not stand up for a bad cause, for he will do whatever he pleases. Since the king's word is supreme, who can say to him, what are you doing? Right? So here's the thing. Are we supposed to be obedient to the king? Yes. Why? Because it's right there, part of our job, part of our duty as a Christian to submit to governing authorities. Now, when the writer of Ecclesiastes wrote this, he was talking to people who lived under the authority of kings. And so oftentimes they would pledge a vow or something to that king in the name of their God. But the point is that you took a vow to serve this king. So obey the king. Now, we're all in the same circumstance. In fact, I want to read from Romans chapter 13, verse 1, that points this out. Even though we may not have taken a vow before a king, Romans 13:1 says this, let every one of you be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against an authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. God has given us authority. He's made us subject to authorities. Now, we're not talking about individual authorities. So now we all have governors and rulers, but God has given the institution of authority. Husbands subject to our wives are subject to their husbands, husbands to God, right? There's these standards of authority that God has given us. And so our job is to submit, to be obedient in those times. God has given us authority. And we as Christians need to learn how to live wisely in the world that we live in, with the authority figures that we serve beneath. And so we have to obey the Lord's command because we took an oath. But there are times where it's not right. And how do you know what those times are? See, the writer here understands that you're not always going to agree with every decision of the king, but the king's word is actually supreme, right? And as long as you're being obedient, then you don't have to fear. That's what verse 5 says. Whoever obeys the king's command will come to no harm, and the wise heart will know the proper time and procedure. So it seems to be a wise thing to obey the king, but there has to be times when submission to the king might be the bad choice, might be unwise, right? I can think of Bible stories that point this out. One of my favorites is the book of Daniel. Daniel was just a young man, a teenager probably, when Nebuchadnezzar came in and destroyed Jerusalem. So I want you to put yourself, kind of think of what it would have been like for him. Just a young man who was ripped away from his family. His home and the place where he believed God dwelled was destroyed, and now it's in rubble. And he's lined up like cattle or like some kind of animal. And as long as he's found to be a person without defect and a high aptitude for learning, then he's going to be carted off from what is his home and taken to Babylon, where he's supposed to serve under a king. That would be so difficult, I think, to lose everything. The one thing that he could offer to God was what he ate. And so he convinced the guard and said, Yeah, I'll do the 3 years of service, but just don't make me eat. I'll just eat vegetables and drink water. That's because all he could devote to God was what he ate. Other than that, he was subject to the king. And he was forced to learn all the Babylonian literature. You know what's amazing about Daniel? He was a good servant of the king who destroyed his city. In fact, as you read the book, you find out that he is one of the top servants of the king. Let's look at Daniel real quick. Daniel chapter 1. Just to point this out. In Daniel chapter 1, and I'm not going to read verses 4 and 5, Kathy. I'm going to read verse 18. But this is what it says. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into the service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found no one else equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. That means Daniel, for 3 years, lived as a subject of the king and learned Babylonian literature. He submitted. Daniel, in fact, didn't just serve King Nebuchadnezzar. He served the king most of his life. Not just Nebuchadnezzar. He goes on to serve Darius when the Persian Empire takes over. He goes on to serve Darius. And so there were times in Daniel's life where he had to decide, do I just submit even though I disagree? And then there were times in Daniel's life when he had to refuse to submit. Now that time came under the king of Persia, much later in life, right? Now as an old man, Darius is king, and he wants to, it's not Darius that does it. It's the other officials in which Daniel was placed over. And they want to find a way to make it seem like Daniel is opposing the king. And so in chapter 6, verse 4 and 5, they say this. They say, at this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of governing affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt or negligent. See, he was a good servant of a king. But here's what it also says. Finally, these men said, we will never find any basis for charge against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of God. They realized, how are we going to get Daniel to do something that opposes the king? And they say, well, we just have to get him to do something that is in conflict with his law. So how'd they do it? They said, anybody who prays to anybody but Darius should be thrown into a lion's den. And Daniel doesn't revolt. He walks quietly upstairs and he sits down on his knees and he points towards Jerusalem and he prays 3 times a day. Then he's thrown into the lion's den. And God delivers him from it. See, Daniel had to decide, when is it right? When is it wise to submit? And when is it wise to not? Here's some of the teacher's advice in verse 3. He says, don't be in a hurry to leave the king's presence, and do not stand up for a bad cause, for he will do whatever he pleases. See, remember, leaving the king's presence is walking away from the king. You're not supposed to be in a hurry to walk away from the king, but you're also not supposed to be in a hurry to submit to a bad cause. So what's wisdom? Do we obey the king, or do we stand up for what's right? And I think wisdom would show us that it's better to obey God rather than man, right? And that's what Peter says when he's brought before the Sanhedrin. Him and all of the apostles in chapter 12, they're upset because they keep talking to people in this name. And Peter stands up and says, you choose what is better. But it's better for us to obey God rather than man. And that's the world that we live in. We are all subject to some kind of authority. And to the best of our ability, we have to live as good citizens. We have to submit because these authorities are given to us by God. But there are times when submission is not the right answer. And it is wisdom that helps us to understand what the right answer is. Sometimes we obey, and other times we refuse. We have to remember, though, that in all times, power is in the hands of God. See, this is what he says in verse 8 of Ecclesiastes chapter 8. He says, no one has power over the wind to contain it, so no one has power over the time of their death, and no one is discharged in times of war, so wickedness will not release those who practice it. See, not even the king can control the wind, but God can. Not even the king can control when a person, control whether or not they're going to die, but God can. Not even a king can walk off the battlefield once the battle's begun, but God can end all battles. And not even the king can save himself from wickedness, but God can save us from wickedness. The key word in those verses is power. It says it twice in verse 8, right? No one has the power, no one has the power. But we know God has the power. And so here we are, we just have to remember that we have to be wise, right? Be wise when serving the king, but know that the ultimate power belongs to God. Sometimes we submit, and sometimes we choose that's better to obey the one who's truly in power. And wisdom helps us with that decision. My next point is that we have to be wise when looking at the wickedness in the world, knowing that God will bring his justice in his time. Be wise when looking at wickedness, knowing that God will bring justice in his time. Do you guys look at our world and see wickedness? Yes, you guys look at our world. It's out there. There's wickedness out there. And sometimes we think, how long, oh Lord, are you going to continue to allow this to happen? Like, I want vengeance now for everyone else, but I want vengeance now. And that's where the writer of Ecclesiastes, see in verse 9, he says, all this I saw, and I applied my mind to everything done under the sun. There was a time for when a man lords it over others to his own hurt. Then too I saw that the wicked were buried, and those who used to come and go from this holy place and receive praise in the city where they did this. This too was meaningless. Now, you think that it might be a good idea or good thing that the wicked are buried, but for the teacher of Ecclesiastes, or the writer of Ecclesiastes for Solomon, this isn't good news that the wicked are buried. See, because a burial is a sign of respect and honor. And doesn't it seem unfair that even the most wicked people get this sign of respect and honor? There's other things that are struggles for him, right? In verse 14, it says, there is something else meaningless that occurs on earth. The righteous who get what the wicked deserve, and the wicked who get what the righteous deserve. This too is meaningless. So I commended to enjoyment in life because there's nothing better for a person to do under the sun. It doesn't seem fair, does it? The righteous get what the wicked deserve, and the wicked get what the righteous deserve. Even Ken was up here talking today about, or in his, I think it was tithing meditation, where he said, if we live wisely, good things are going to happen, right? That he quoted Proverbs. I have a proverb in Proverbs chapter 3 that points this out too. This is the world that we think we want to live in. Here's what it says: my son, don't forget my teaching, but keep my commandments in your heart, for they will prolong your life many years and bring you peace and prosperity. In the world that's not crooked, if you live wisely, you're going to live long and in peace and prosperity. But the writer of Ecclesiastes is frustrated because he sees the wicked sometimes get what the righteous deserve, and the righteous sometimes get what the wicked deserve, and that doesn't seem fair. It shouldn't seem fair to us, right? And we believe in God. We believe he is a God of truth and a God of justice. And because of that, we believe God is going to make things right. He's going to lift up the oppressed and punish the oppressor. He's going to make things right. But when we look at a world and it doesn't seem right, because the wicked are buried in honor sometimes. I was thinking about it. In 1994, just to give you guys an idea, I was 14. So this isn't clear from my memory so much. I remember the event. But in 1994, there was 100 days of genocide in Rwanda. Do you guys remember it? It was so much so that I took down these notes. 330 people died every hour for 100 days. That means 5 people died every minute for 100 days. It's a lot of people. And doesn't it seem unfair? And what happens to those people? They're buried. The wicked are buried. And then we all forget about it. That doesn't seem right. And it takes wisdom to look at those circumstances and believe that we have a God of justice. Right? And that frustrates the teacher. Look at verse 11. He says, when the sentence for a crime is not quickly carried out, people's hearts are filled with schemes to do wrong. So when wicked people get what the righteous deserve, and it doesn't seem like they get punished for their wickedness, then that just incentivizes other people to be wicked. And it also makes it so we become more skeptical about the God of justice. But look at where his hope is in verse 12. And if there's any verse you want to highlight in chapter 8, I know it's a rough chapter, Ecclesiastes is a rough book, but if there's any verse you want to highlight, it's verse 12 and 13. And this is what it says. Although a wicked person who commits 100 crimes may live a long time, I know it is better for those who fear God, who are reverent before him. Yet because the wicked do not fear God, it will not go well with them, and their days will not lengthen like a shadow. If there's anything you want to highlight in this chapter, it's that, because even though he looks at a world that it doesn't seem like things are always fair, he knows that God is going to make things right. He trusts that God is going to set things right. The problem is he doesn't know when, but he trusts that it's going to happen. And I think this is actually one of the more hopeful verses in the book of Ecclesiastes, because what he's saying or implying in there is that even if they live a long life, God is still going to punish them. It's still not going to work out well for them. And see, that takes wisdom. It takes wisdom, which is the fear of the Lord, to understand that when we live in a world that seems like it's going crooked, it's wrong, it takes wisdom to say, I know that's happening now, but justice is going to come in the end, because Jesus has come to set the oppressed free. And we look forward to that day, right? When he comes back to judge. And until then, we live in this world and are frustrated by the effects of this world, but the wise choice is to trust God through it. The wise choice is to accept that God is going to make things right and bring justice in his time. And that's not always your time, right? Gosh, I know it's frustrating. I do. I know when I see wickedness in the world, I want to stop it now. But I'm always thankful that God didn't stop it 20 years ago, right? Because I would have been included with those wicked people. Now I'd probably have to go back more than 20 years, because I've been a Christian for longer than that now. So maybe I'm getting old too. On top of more righteous, I'm also getting old. Anyways, I do think that. I think when people say, I want justice now, I always think, well, it's because you're on the right side of it right now. But anyway, the point is God's going to bring this in his time. It takes wisdom to look at a world that's crooked and say, I know God is a God of justice. Wisdom does that. Until then, verse 15, I commend enjoyment in life, because there's nothing better for a person to do under the sun than eat, drink, and be glad. Their joy will accompany them. There is, in spite of the fact that sometimes we serve under evil rulers, and in spite of the fact that injustices happen all around us, we should not let it make our life sour. We should still live in the expectation of what Jesus is going to do when he returns. My last point is real short, so I'll actually end on time. It's the best wisdom fails to comprehend all that God has done. And I changed it in a second. So I changed it. The best wisdom comes through God's revelation. Best wisdom comes through God's revelation. It's a more positive way of saying what I intended to say. But it's in verse 16 and 17. He says this, when I applied my mind to know wisdom and to observe the labor that is done on earth, people getting no sleep day or night. Then I saw all that God has done. No one can comprehend what God has done under the sun. Despite all of their efforts to search it out, no one can discover its meaning. Even the wise claim they know. They cannot really comprehend it. So that's the main point at the end. Even the wise think they know, but they can't really comprehend it. And that's linking us back to the beginning part of this section, right? The wise have bright faces, but the wise can't really understand all that God is doing. And so maybe the best wisdom is to trust God in the things that we don't understand. The best wisdom comes from accepting that there are things that we can't always comprehend, but that Jesus is there with us through it. Jesus is God's revelation. He learned from God. He taught by God. He showed us who God was. He was a light. The best wisdom understands who Jesus is. And the way that we live in this world is by trusting in him. Because if there's anything, any satisfaction in life, it comes from living under the sun. S-O-N, Jesus.